like to begin today by asking a simple question, and we'll explore this more as we go through the sermon, but the question is simply, are you happy? For too many people, happiness is very elusive or even non-existent in their life, and this is not just something we deal with in our modern world. In the early 1770s, in the North American colonies, they were seeing great political divide amongst the people who had a very common heritage. On one side, there were those who were loyal to the King of England, and they gave him great deference in how he governed this new land. On the other side, there were those who believed the king and his agents had gone too far in controlling their lives. And they were citizens of the British Empire, but they felt they were taxed unnecessarily to support things they didn't like and to have no representation in the government. Without truly knowing what was going on behind the scenes, both sides were part of an argument between brothers, Ephraim and Manasseh. They had to separate because of the future God had in store for each of them, but they chose war in separating. But as the colonists came to terms with their decision to revolt from the king, they had to still answer the question of how they would govern themselves. The nations of Europe all had kings and queens ruling them. This is what they just revolted against. And so what form of government would they take? The men who were selected to represent each colony, for the most part, they were all very well educated. They had great backgrounds with what we would call classical instruction. They studied Greek and Latin. They studied those cultures of Greek and Rome and many others. And they saw in those histories a common thread of democracy that they wanted to emulate, a people ruled by the consent of the people. Their noble experiment, as it has been called, has given us this nation, but the irony that many who were part of creating this democracy realized is that the failure of this system lay in its initial strength, and that is, the weakness is that eventually the people, the governed, will realize that they can vote for themselves all manner of benefits from the public treasury, at which point democracy then slides into mob rule. Nonetheless, the founders of this nation wanted each citizen to be a determiner of their own fate, and we read this in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, where it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Do we have an unalienable right from God to pursue happiness? In seeking fulfillment of that statement, many in this country have twisted God's instruction to create their own morality. Some of you are old enough to remember from the late 60s and early 70s the statement, "If it feels good, do it." Whatever you wanted to do, as long as it made you happy. That has morphed into that statement, "If it makes you happy, then do it." And then there was even the popular song of a few years ago that was simply, "Don't worry, be happy." This aspect of happiness that people can be consumed with. But what should our view as a Christian be when it comes to this topic of happiness? Are we to be like the Stoics and the monks of old and deny any pleasure at all in this life? Or should we go to the other end of the spectrum and pursue happiness no matter where that pursuit takes us? What would God have us do? This is what we're going to look at today, this topic of happiness and what our Christian perspective should be. And so then the title is simply, "Are you happy?" Now, happiness is not just a singular emotion, and unfortunately, like so many things in our modern world, we've twisted concepts to mean things that they haven't always meant or what they really should mean. But synonyms of happiness are words like bliss, elation, glee, amusement, cheer, contentment. So we have a range of emotions in there, but for the purposes of the sermon today, I'm going to include joy and happiness together. There are many, when you look at this topic, that will separate those two. They say they're different, but I want to look at them in context together. But what does happiness look like for most people? Well, for most people, it's outside themselves. They look for happiness in a job or a career, title, maybe a position of some sort. Maybe it's being married, having children. Maybe it's having certain knowledge. Maybe it's having a certain number of friends or any number of other things. But they think that's what brings happiness. This view is looking at happiness as something outside themselves. But happiness doesn't rest in someone or something else. It begins with each of us taking responsibility for life choices. And I think that's part of why so many are unhappy in the world around us. But it doesn't mean that happiness is only found in ourselves either. In fact, only looking inward can be the cause of much unhappiness. Selfishness leads to unhappiness. There's a proverb that we won't turn to. It's Proverbs 30, verse 15. In the context, it's talking about other things, but there is an interesting connection to this topic. It talks there that there are two daughters, and that what they say is give, meaning to them, give, I want more. And so you have this unsatiableness at times that can consume people and make them very unhappy. Along this line, I have a great quote from a fellow named Robert Anthony, who was an American writer of some years ago. He said, most people would rather be certain they're miserable than risk being happy. And there's something about our human nature that buys into that, isn't it? We'd much rather commiserate and moan and groan and complain than to actually do something about being happy. Again, we can look at the misery and the anger all around us. I came across an interesting study this past week, a study on loneliness. And this is from a journal called International Psychogeriatrics. And they said this: in a study released just this past week, it's found that loneliness affects as much as 3/4 of the U.S. population. And that's a pretty high number, isn't it? I found that very stunning to read. Continuing, they say further, loneliness appears to spike at specific times during adulthood. Late 20s, mid-50s, and late 80s are times when you are most at risk of feeling lonely. And they went on to describe that part of the reason, the biggest part of the reason for those particular dates in people's lives is that those are generally times of transition in their lives. It says what surprised researchers the most about this finding was that the group studied, and this is their quote, was a normal population. I always laugh when I read that, because what's normal? For their purposes, what they were talking about was these were people that were not in any kind of counseling. They weren't dealing with any kind of problems psychologically in their lives, just what, average Joe on the street sort of thing. What they said was this was not a group of people at high risk for emotional problems. For me, in light of those findings and reading that study, the question that came to mind then was what brings loneliness? And part of the answer is the culture, that we're more connected to each other perhaps than any other time in history. That is, we have things like Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat, and actually even just with cell phones, we can call, we can email, we can text pretty much any time. But in spite of all that connections, we're really pretty isolated. Neighbors don't know neighbors. You spend time with coworkers, you leave work, you never see them, talk to them. So we have rather these connections that are not very deep in life. So why do people become unhappy? Well, I found this interesting chart dynamic from a lady named Anna Vital, and she had these things in there. She said people become unhappy because they set expectations unrealistically high. People want things perfect, or they want it a certain way, and when that's not accomplished, then they become very unhappy. She said they also measure unhappiness in the wrong units. What she meant by that was they're looking for happiness in the wrong things. We think it's a new car, or it's the latest technological gadget, or it's things of this nature. The problem with that is we get bored with them, don't we? Or they get outdated very quickly. She says they also confuse not being bad with being good. So if I'm not engaging in this wrong behavior, that makes me good, but there's not a direct connection there. The causation is weak. She said they try to find meaning in being unhappy. And I suspect most of us have been around people like that. They're the happiest being miserable, sort of thing. They wallow in their misery. Another thing is that people are unhappy because they find commiserators. You can have a bad point in your life, but rather than having friends that help you through that, out of that, onto something better, you're surrounded by people that want to let that remain as it is. There are others, though, she said also, that think that misery follows happiness. You know, the sort of ER mentality. You know, even though I'm enjoying this now, it's certainly going to turn bad in a little bit. So you can see some of those things, but again, to ask the question, do you have joy or do you have happiness in your life? It can be hard at times that we might want to, rather we don't consider the happiness because we see so much pain and suffering in the world around us. Certainly the news is just a non-stop stream of these negative things that are happening in the world. There's also a deep fear of the future, what might happen. It can be very hard to find and have joy. And yet for us, you and I, God's people, of all the people alive at this time in mankind's history, we should be filled with joy. We know why there is suffering in this life. We don't take joy in that, but we know that it is being used to serve a purpose and that it won't be here forever. We know what is the cause of the suffering, and that won't be there forever. We don't fear the future because we know God's plan, if you will, through prophecy, through what we read in Scripture, knowing His plan of salvation for mankind. We have a great hope and an understanding of what awaits mankind. We have no need of anger because we have the truth of God. We have every reason to have great joy. But let's turn to Acts 16. Again, what does it mean to be happy? What does that look like? And again, the world around us views this happiness as something outside of ourselves. You know, I get the whatever. You know, I get the award. I get the recognition. I'm able to have the newest of whatever it is. But that doesn't last, does it? Like I say, because those things are temporary. And if we look for things to bring us happiness, then those will always fail us. And so in the midst of problems, can we have joy? Can we have happiness? And here in Acts chapter 16, we have an interesting thought to consider. As Paul was going out, at this time he was with Silas, they would go into these communities and they would preach the gospel. And in a lot of the communities, it was not well received. For the Gentiles, it might be because Paul was speaking against idolatry and some of the things in terms of a lifestyle that they were engaged in, but even in many of the Jewish communities, what they heard Paul speak to them was heresy. And so oftentimes, Paul would run up against severe opposition. In this case, he did as well. The local community was so incensed, they had him thrown in prison. In prison, anciently, basically were holes where they would stick people. They might remember to feed you. They'd come around every so often to check upon you, but nothing like even the prisons of today. And so how do you have happiness in those environments? How do you not become discouraged? So in Acts 16, verse 25, we just read this one insight into what Paul and Silas were thinking of in the midst of this. It says, at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And I can only imagine what those other prisoners were thinking. These guys were off the rocker. You know, in the midst of being shackled here, if I remember the context, their feet were in the stocks, so they were locked down, so they couldn't move, they couldn't walk around. Obviously, they were in prison in general, to be restricted in that way. But yet, instead of focusing on those discomforts and those temporary setbacks, as we know from the story, they were singing praises to God. They were being punished, if you will. They were in the midst of trials because of what God had asked them to do, but they were happy about that. Again, is there happiness in your life? Sometimes the hardest time to have happiness is when we are dealing with these things. And yet, on the flip side, it's probably the time when we need happiness the most, the right kind of happiness. Because again, God has given us a calling beyond anything we could dream up. So what are the initial, or not initial, what are the temporary setbacks we might have now? Are they worth not focusing on what God is promising us? We have the Sabbath day. We look forward to that every week, don't we? If we have the right frame of mind, we do. But we also know that this day pictures a rest that God desires for all of mankind. Not just for one, not just for one day, but as a life. And the Sabbath day can remind us of God sending Christ to be our Savior and all that Christ did for us, all that he continues to do for us. Do we have joy? Do we rejoice in this Sabbath day and the relationship we have with him? Let's go next to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews 12, in the previous chapter, obviously chapter 11, we have what's called the faith chapter, where you have record of many faithful preceding the first century, what they did, what they went through, the many trials, how they served God and various things. And then at the beginning of chapter 12, Paul then says, because of this, therefore, we're surrounded by these great cloud of witnesses, then let's move forward. Let's set aside the things holding us back. Let's press on. In verse 2 then, he says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, it takes a very special mindset, doesn't it, to know that you're going to come and die, that you're going to die a very painful, prolonged death, to be humiliated before the populace, to be seen as a rebel, as a criminal, and yet he came and did that with joy. This is the kind of happiness that is not fixed on something outside of yourself, and it has the right context of being inside ourselves, because that joy was for us, knowing that through what he would go through, rather, you and I could be part of his family, that everyone that God would call could have God's Spirit and begin to understand these things that you and I understand. I think part of the problem in not having happiness is that for most of us, our lives become routine. We're comfortable enough, especially in this nation, that we just go through life without a whole lot of struggle, especially compared to so many in the rest of the world. But we can get into these routines. We go to bed at the same time. We get up at the same time to go to work. We go through the same routines getting ready for work. We get in our car, and probably in most cases we don't even think about how we get to work. How many of you have been driving to some place you regularly go, you're not paying attention, suddenly you look up and it's like, wow, I didn't realize I was already here. Because your mind was somewhere else, you just put it on autopilot and there you go. But the downside of that routine can be boredom, isn't it? Let's go next to 1 Peter 4. And unfortunately, when people get bored, they generally start focusing on the wrong things. 1 Peter 4 and verse 13, Peter writes this. He says, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings. Now, Christ came in part to be sacrificed for our sins. He also came to qualify to rule. But in all of that, he really was kind of on his own humanly, wasn't he? How many friends did he have, and how did his family view him? He certainly in the community was chastised and ostracized, and yet we're here to rejoice in the extent that we partake of those same sufferings. It says that when his glory is revealed, you may be also glad with exceeding joy, that we can be reminded of the joy that we're supposed to have. So are you happy that God has called you and revealed his plan of salvation to you? I've unfortunately had friends, acquaintances over the years in God's church where at some point they lamented that God called them when they did because they, in their minds, missed out on things. Well, that's one view, but it's not a very good view. We're being given the opportunity to be on the ground floor of something, and I've mentioned that in sermons before, the opportunity to be involved with something before anybody else realizes the value of it. But another problem we have that limits happiness, especially in the Western world, is that we value, as I've mentioned, things over people. So when we don't have the things we want, our happiness is diminished. Look at the rush in the world around us currently for people to go out and buy gifts for people. And I can only imagine, they spend money wondering if the person will ever even really want it in some cases. But even in having things, we lose our happiness in them because things wear out. They get old, cars break down, computers wear out, clothes go out of style, or they shrink. But God designed us to be social creatures. Some of us are more social than others. Some of us crave that more than others. But none of us are very good when we isolate ourselves. We can even become very unhappy in those things. But this aspect of relationship certainly includes our relationship with the Father and the Son, that we're to be connected with them. I have another quote for you. This is from a fellow named Joseph Addison back in late early 1700s. He was an English statesman. He said, "Friendship improves happiness and abates misery by doubling our joys and dividing our grief." Happiness, from his view, and I agree with it, improves when we go outside of ourselves. Let's go to Hebrews 10. Let's go back to Hebrews chapter 10, and we'll begin in verse 24. Paul here says, "Let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, to know that you're connected." It doesn't even have to be something you do. We have the prayer requests that go out regularly. We have the reminders of people that are missing. And we're encouraged to call them, to email them, to write them, to visit them. And I hear regularly from individuals who are in those situations how much that means to them, that they're not home alone, isolated, forgotten, that there are still people who care for them, think of them, and pray for them. And to be reminded, as we say here, to provoke one another to love and good works. And then to continue in verse 25, "Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching." This is why the Sabbath is very important, to maintain and develop those connections, to have the conversations, to realize, to put things in perspective, I should say, that life may not be as bad as we might think it is. Right? We can be in the midst of a trial. You've had just an awful week. The boss has been on you. The car is breaking down. Whatever's going on in your life. And you can come to church and you can set all that aside and be reminded what it is that God is offering and all of these other brethren that are dealing with the same things. And we're in that sense together. We can be lifted up. We can be encouraged. Do we find happiness being in God's family? Do we look forward to these assembling togethers? Make sure that we have those relationships and we maintain them. One of the things I've said to people over the years that tend to drift out, and I try to encourage them to attend. I actually had one lady tell me one time that the reason she didn't come is she had nothing more to learn. I was pretty stunned at that statement. I said, wow, if I ever get to that place, I hope somebody slaps me. But I said, look, you're missing a bigger element. I said, let's just accept your premise and that you have nothing else to learn. I said, what about the people you could teach then? And I said, at the very least, you're missing out on the conversations of knowing what you can pray for to help those people. That's why I say you have to be very careful about selfishness. Let me get back on my notes here. Let's go to James chapter 1 next. This goes back to this concept of where happiness comes from, because James here makes a statement that's very challenging when we consider it. Now, he begins his epistle here talking about trials. So in verse 2, he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." And he goes on to elaborate on why they should consider it a point of joy, count it as joy, because of what it brings. So he's not talking about being a sadist, and that as God corrects us, or as circumstances of life sort of beat on us, that we take joy in that, but rather the joy of where it's leading us. This is the same joy that Christ had in coming and dying for us. The joy is in what it will bring. That as God shapes us. You know, as a young man, what I thought was a trial is much different of what I see as a trial in my life now. There's a perspective that comes with life. And we're to have that spiritually as well. Philippians 4, let's go there next. Philippians chapter 4. And that's why this verse explains why I said earlier that happiness lies outside of ourselves, but not the way most people think. Philippians 4 and verse 4, Paul here again writing, he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Again, I say rejoice. You know, if we try to have happiness through a person or people, we will be disappointed at some point because we let each other down. We fail in some regard, and then we hurt each other. But when we rejoice in God, we can have confidence that that's not the way that relationship is going to go. He will not fail us. He will not disappoint us. And what's interesting in this verse here is that the word rejoice in the language, in how it's structured in the Greek, is an imperative command. It's imperative that we rejoice. It is not a suggestion. It is not a comment. It is something that he is telling us is required. Now, it's not that God needs that from us, but he knows that in doing it, it brings other things with it. It gains us a perspective, doesn't it? We don't have to chase the things in life. You know, there was the fellow in the news this week that, I forget which lottery it was that he won. He'd even forgotten that he bought the lottery ticket. The family remembered that he bought the ticket. It was in his vehicle. He had his own business of some sorts. He rummaged through his vehicle. He found the ticket. He turned it in, and it's millions of dollars. You know, so they're all ecstatic over this. And, you know, if it came my way, I wouldn't turn it down either, but you have to be careful with that because that puts a different perspective on things, doesn't it? More people have gone broke winning the lottery than any other way almost because they overextend themselves. They get into buying things, trying to chase that joy. But here in Philippians 4:4, what this is inferring is that we're to always be in this aspect of happiness before God, rejoicing before him in every circumstance or in every condition, like Paul and Silas when they were in prison, like James saying when you're in various trials. That puts a different perspective on what that happiness should be and what it should look like. The loneliness study that I quoted from earlier also had some other interesting insights as to how to combat loneliness, and I found that interesting because to me loneliness is very much connected to unhappiness. They said wisdom serves as a buffer against loneliness. Now that caught my attention because not many people talk about wisdom doing anything. So here's what they meant by it. They elaborated. They said people better able to control their emotions can more capably handle anxiety related to loneliness. In other words, they rule over their emotions. So they don't let the circumstances of life dictate how they should feel. They go on to say those who self-reflect have a greater understanding of why they feel lonely. So they're analyzing and they're saying, what am I doing? Maybe I'm in a sour mood and nobody wants to be around me. And if I change my sour mood, maybe people will want to be around me. And so they can go through this and understand. We'll come back to that point in another way here in a minute. They go on to say spirituality and empathy help a person feel more connected to others. Now, I wasn't going to drill down and find out what they meant by spirituality, but I have a general context of what they mean here. What are the commonalities between what they're saying in spirituality and empathy, helping them be more connected? They're going outside themselves, aren't they? Their life, their happiness is not just them. It's also the connections, what I said earlier about the relationships that they have. It helps them to be happy because they're not solely focused. I think one of the reasons why God encourages us in a number of different places in Scripture to pray for one another, to stir up love, to provoke one another in the right way, all of these various admonitions, is so that we don't stay centered on us. The last item here, they say that it's important to interact with others who share values or interests. There is happiness by being connected to a bigger group. We do that, don't we? Every Sabbath, every holy day, hopefully in between those times as well. So can you choose to be happy? Various studies have shown that choosing to be happy is no different than any other decision that we would make in life. I choose to get this car. Why did you buy that car? You know, I choose to get this. You know, we have these very personal tastes, don't we, in life? Choosing to be happy is no different than many of those other decisions. And the bottom line is that we do get to choose every day whether we are going to be happy or not. There's a psalm that we'll read about that here in a little bit. But there are positives to being happy. Studies have shown that happy people are more likable and desirable to be around. And that should just be axiomatic. Nobody likes a sourpuss. Right? You know, old Eeyore's wonder he had friends at all. Happy people, they say, are consistently reported, they consistently report an improved quality of life. Because they're happy, they see life differently. They're not focused on the negative things. They enjoy life and everything in it. But how do we choose happiness? Some will say it's not a switch we can flip. There might be other things happening, whether it's histories of the families we grew up in or any number of things in terms of relationships that have made that difficult. But there's a book entitled How We Choose to Be Happy. And they had several points. I'll read some of them here in terms of choosing, how happy people choose to be happy. The first one they said was that they intend to be happy. This goes back to the comment of just a moment ago, that they choose to be happy, not unhappy. They make a conscious effort to be happy, to not be fixated on it. You know, in our world, it can be very hard at times when people are so unhappy. That can impact us if we're not careful. You know, just driving to work. All the people that are unhappy and the things that they can do that begin to make you unhappy. But do we allow that? Do we allow someone to have that kind of control over us? A fellow named William Adams, who was a famous English navigator, he said this along this line: most of us are just about as happy as we make up our minds to be. So let's go to Psalm 30. Read something along this line. Psalm chapter 30 and in verse 5. David here writes, he says, for his anger, he's speaking about God and various other aspects earlier, for his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. So we can choose happiness even if we've had the most miserable of miserable days. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and it was just beyond unpleasant. And we can cry about it, and we can say how wrong it was, but every morning we can decide that it's going to be different. Even in what God deals with us, it says here that his anger is but for a moment. When we think God is very harsh with us, punishing us in a way that we are not very comfortable with, it says his favor is for life. His desire is not for the punishment, but for what the correction will bring. And so even if it brings this weeping, that every day then we get to start over. We don't have to continue shackled by things unnecessarily. Another point they raise here in how to choose happiness is to be accountable, that we're accountable for our own actions and that others are not responsible for our happiness. When we give people that kind of power, then we give them control, don't we? And it's not that we shouldn't try to take care of each other, but if I'm waiting on you to bring me happiness, and you don't bring that happiness when and how I want, then that begins to negatively change the relationship, doesn't it? It gives them power. And then we get frustrated, we get angry. To be accountable for our own actions. They say, discover what makes you happy. It can be something simple. It can be something that no one else necessarily appreciates in one form or the other, but happiness and what brings you happiness. You know, simple pleasures in life can oftentimes be the things that bring us some of the most joy. They also talked about turning problems into opportunities. And I think this is something that we especially need to look at as we go through trials in life. We can oftentimes look at them as punishment, as opposed to correction, or in this case, as an opportunity. What is it that I can learn from this? Looking back in my life, I can see so many of these times. I'm thankful for God's mercy. But sometimes, you know, in teaching the lesson, it can show you opportunities. It can show you how to approach things. It can show you how to have the right relationships, the conversations. It can show you all kinds of things. Am I willing to learn from what I go through in life? To be encouraged by that. One of the other items is that we should express appreciation, that we can bring happiness into our lives by showing appreciation to others. This is especially true if you know of someone who is a good gift giver. They pay attention to somebody and they give them something, bringing them joy. But there's probably as much, if not more, joy in what they're giving them because they know how meaningful it is to the person. Along this line, they say to share unselfishly. Another quote here from Ethel Andrus, an American educator back in the early 1900s. She said, "We learn the inner secret of happiness when we learn to direct our inner drives, our interest, and our attention to something outside ourselves." We're not focused on being selfish. Let's go to Psalm 118 as we begin to wrap this up. The whole of Psalm 118 is about praising God. I used this a couple of weeks ago in a Sabbath thought. When we think about what God does for us, I mentioned that I'm thankful for his mercy. I'm thankful for his protection. I saw again this past week a 3-lane exit. Those things never cease to amaze me. It's like, really? You couldn't hold up for 2 seconds and get behind the cars. You've got to speed up and then cut over all at once. His protection from us in other ways as well, not just physically. His love for us and the joy that we should have then in seeing these blessings. So Psalm 118 and in verse 24, the psalmist writes here, he says, "This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." Now, in that Sabbath thought, I was making a connection to this day, the Sabbath day. I was making a connection to God sending Christ, that this is the day, that day we should praise in. But for the point of this sermon today, we could expand this, and we could look at this every day. This is the day, whatever day this is. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it, going back to that choosing, that every day we can start fresh, that every day we can rejoice and be glad in it, that God has given us another day. You know, I woke up on the warm side of the dirt, sort of thing. In considering this as well, even in terms of what I mentioned about Jesus Christ, you know, we can expand that thought out, that we have someone who, because of the joy he had, is doing other things for us as well. That he's as an elder brother, that we can go to the Father through him, that Christ will advocate for us, as we read in John 14:16, the Holy Spirit there, the word is parakletos, which is an advocate or a helper, that Christ functions in the very same way with us. And it can sound trite, but we should not be lonely if Christ is working in our life. Our calling is not about our comfort, but rather about taking on God's character. They're not mutually exclusive, however, and it's not that God has called us, as I said earlier, to be these monks and stoics that simply deny any pleasure in life. But let's conclude in Philippians chapter 4. The point I'm making, and the point I hope to leave with you today, is that the physical things of life are all well and good. You know, simple pleasures of a Friday evening, and even if it's a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, that you can sit down and you can make it special. You can share it with friends. You can pull out some nice items that you might have in terms of glasses or flatware, dinnerware, and it's not about those things, trying to replicate a five-star restaurant, but rather that you appreciate the Sabbath, you appreciate the blessings God has given you, you appreciate having the friends to be with, and we need to think about those things in terms of happiness. Philippians 4 and verse 8, I call this section the whatsoevers, because Paul is reminding us here of a perspective of life. He says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of a good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. You know, what we allow in our minds greatly affect not only how we think, but what we become. Paul here is reminding us that what we should put in our minds is remembrance of all these good things. Look at what God has given us. What, if we could, what would it cost to buy the knowledge that we have? To know what God is going to give us. We couldn't begin to buy it. Look at what God has done in your life. I don't know your stories. I know my stories. To see God's hands, and what's really humbling at times is to ponder what God has done that we don't have any clue in our lives. The times He's protected us, delivered us, the times He has watched over us, the blessings that we received, we had no idea what He did. To meditate on these things. Verse 9 then, these things which you have learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do. This commonality, that the joy of being part of a group. Not because we're not lonely, but that we are together, part of something. He said, and may the God of peace be with you. You know, this world, as I said, is just full of anger. And they don't know why they're angry. But most of it is selfishness. To continue in verse 11, it says, not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am in to be content. That's a challenge. But when we achieve this, when we can just allow our lives to be what God is going to make it, that we need to learn from where we are, it gives a great sense of relief in life. I don't have to chase and think that I've missed out if I don't have the fame or the money or the car or the clothes or the house or whatever it is that people think will bring them happiness. That wherever I am, to be content. Verse 12, I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Can we be happy in whatever the circumstances are in life? Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and suffer need. And notice a strong connection here in terms of what we're talking about today and where happiness should be centered. That I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And then lastly in verse 18, he says, indeed, I have all and abound. This was Paul, who had been shipwrecked numerous times, who had been stoned, who had been scourged with 40 stripes, who had gone through all that he had gone through. He talked about the nights and days in the deeps, in the depths, I should say, meaning floating in the oceans after shipwrecks, all the things that he went through. This is him now saying, I have all and abound. See, it's not about having the perfect life. It's not about having the right things. It's not about anything that the world would pursue. Happiness is about a perspective of God in our lives, working out his purpose and what we will be a part of now and in the future. He says, I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you. It goes back to my earlier comment. He was touched. And if we put it in a modern vernacular, he was touched by the cards and the phone calls and the gifts sent to be reminded of everyone concerned for him. He said, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. That God himself takes great joy in seeing how we interact as a family. We of all people, again, should be the happiest people of the earth. To see God working in our lives, all that he has blessed us with, all that he is working out for us and the rest of mankind to be part of his family. And so I will leave you with the same question I started with. Are you happy?